Welcome back to Things You Don't Know. Most of us know that a dozen means 12, right? 12 eggs, 12 donuts, 12 roses. But walk into a bakery and ask for a baker's dozen, and ordinary mathematics suddenly changes because you get 13. It sounds like a quaint tradition, perhaps something bakers invented simply to appear generous. But the most widely accepted explanation takes us back to medieval England, where bread was heavily regulated, and selling an undersized loaf could get a baker into serious trouble.
Oh, yeah. So that 13th loaf, it may not have originally been generosity at all. It may have been a form of insurance. Give the customer slightly too much, and you reduce the risk of being accused of giving them too little. And that makes the baker's dozen considerably more interesting than just a bakery promotion. They were potentially in a very practical economic reason for that extra loaf.
Ladies and gentlemen, we should put an important qualification on this story from the beginning. Historians cannot prove that the medieval bread laws directly created the expression baker's dozen because the phrase itself does not appear in surviving records until centuries later. The connection between bread regulation and the extra loaf is plausible and widely accepted, but we have to distinguish between a strong historical explanation and something we can document step by step.
Okay, so to understand why governments cared so much about the size of a loaf, remember what bread meant in the medieval society. It was not simply another grocery item. For much of the population, grain products made up a major part of the daily diet. If the price, weight, or quality of bread was manipulated, ordinary people felt the effects immediately. Medieval consumers therefore faced a problem we should still recognize today. How could they know whether they were actually getting what they paid for?
Dr. Weaver, that was especially difficult when there was no sealed package giving you the net weight. You were buying bread from a local baker, and the finished product could vary considerably from one batch to another. English authorities therefore developed regulations commonly known as the Assizes of Bread and Ale, which govern two of the most important staples of everyday life. Versions of these regulations existed over a very long period, with some of the best known rules associated with the 13th century.
In modern language, we might describe at least part of that system as consumer protection. Authorities were trying to make sure that someone buying an essential food received the quantity and the quality that had been promised to them. At the same time, it went beyond consumer protection because the government was also regulating the economics of the food supply. Bread was simply too important to just leave completely uncontrolled. Now, here's something that sounds strange, at least from a modern perspective. If wheat became more expensive, then you might assume that the baker would simply just raise the price of a loaf. Under the assize system, however, that was not necessarily how the adjustment worked. The relationship between grain prices and the permitted size of the loaf was regulated.
As wheat became more expensive, the prescribed loaf could become lighter. When wheat became cheaper, the loaf was expected to become heavier. The regulations contained detailed schedules strictly specifying how much different types of bread should weigh at different grain prices. So the baker was not simply told, don't cheat the customer. He was working under measurable standards created by his guild that determined what a legal loaf was supposed to contain and how much.
And that creates a practical problem because bread is not a perfectly uniform manufactured product. Flour varies, moisture varies, dough varies, and baking removes water. So, two loaves that begin at approximately the same size may not weigh exactly the same when they come out of the oven. That means even an honest baker could accidentally find himself on the wrong side of the official scale. When the penalties for coming up short were serious, a small difference in weight mattered.
Now, this is where some modern versions of the story become exaggerated. You will sometimes hear spurious claims that a medieval baker who sold an underweight loaf would automatically be beaten, imprisoned, or even have their hand cut off. The surviving regulations give us a less sensational but still serious picture. Violations could result in monetary penalties called immersements, while repeated or sufficiently serious offenses involving underweight bread could result in the baker being placed in the pillory. That's a fancy word for the stocks in the town square.
Now, the pillory was hardly a minor inconvenience because it meant being publicly restrained and publicly humiliated. In a small community, everybody could see that the baker had been convicted of cheating customers. And that punishment could therefore damage more than just the baker's pride. It could also damage his reputation and very likely his ability to keep customers. He could lose everything.
So we do not need the dramatic legends about mutilation to understand why bakers had an incentive to be cautious. A fine could hurt financially, and public punishment could hurt the business itself. The obvious lesson was that a baker did not want his bread to come up short. If there was uncertainty, it made sense to err on the side of giving the buyer more rather than less.
Now we finally arrive at the good old number 13. Now, imagine that a customer, a merchant, or a bread reseller orders 12 loaves, while the baker knows that the finished weights can vary and that short measure can bring penalties. The safest solution is pretty straightforward. Just include some extra bread. Instead of risking 12 loaves being judged as insufficient, the baker can simply add another loaf and create a comfortable margin.
Think of it as a primitive form of business insurance. If 12 loaves are supposed to represent a certain amount, and you are worried that natural variations might leave the total below what is expected, adding an extra loaf greatly reduces that risk. You sacrifice a little product, but you also make it much harder for anyone to claim that you shortchanged the buyer. For someone operating under strict regulations, that could be a very sensible trade indeed.
That is the traditional explanation for the baker's dozen: 12 ordered, 13 supplied. Dictionaries still associate the expression with the old custom of bakers adding an extra loaf to an order of 12. This happens in modern times with the fast food restaurant Five Guys. They always give their customers an extra scoop of French fries. We cannot document the exact moment when that custom began, but the economic logic behind it is easy to understand. When being slightly short can cost you money, or more importantly, reputation, being slightly generous becomes the safer choice. There is another wrinkle because bakers did not necessarily sell every loaf directly to the person who eventually ate it. Bread could also be supplied to intermediaries, sometimes described in historical sources as hucksters, who then resold it elsewhere. That creates another possible function for the extra loaf. The extra bread might sometimes have helped provide the reseller with a workable profit margin.
That's right, Dr. Dineen. And that makes sense in a market where the official price of bread was being regulated. If a reseller could not simply increase the price of every loaf, receiving something a little extra from the baker could create room for profit when the bread was resold. So the 13th loaf may have served more than just one purpose. It could protect the baker from accusations of short measure while also helping support the commercial system that moves bread from bakers to customers.
That is why the simple version of the story, bakers were frightened, so they threw in a free loaf, does not quite capture everything going on. There were consumer protection concerns, problems with measuring bread accurately, government regulation, and commercial relationships all operating at the same time. The extra loaf may have been useful precisely because it solved several problems at once. What later looked like generosity may originally have been very practical business arithmetic.
Now, there's an obvious alternative here that it deserves some consideration. Why not simply make all 12 loaves slightly larger and just avoid the need for an extra loaf altogether? That would seem to protect the baker from short weight while allowing him to continue selling exactly a dozen, 12. But economically, it creates a different problem.
Okay, if every loaf contains substantially more flour than necessary, the baker is giving away extra product every time he bakes. Over hundreds or thousands of loaves, those small amounts add up. Adding one extra loaf to a bulk order creates a simpler and more predictable buffer. Instead of oversizing everything, the baker can provide one clearly identifiable piece of extra bread.
We should also remember that medieval bakers were trying to earn a living under strict regulations that could even calculate all allowable expenses and gains. Surviving a sized material discusses such things as food and wages for servants, fuel, salt, and all other costs involved in producing bread. This was not casual household baking, it was a regulated business operating within fairly narrow margins. 13 therefore becomes a practical compromise, enough extra bread to reduce the risk without unnecessarily enlarging every individual loaf.
Of course, there is another question hiding inside this discussion. Before we can explain why a baker's dozen is 13, we might ask why people were organizing goods into groups of 12 in the first place. Now, 12 had several advantages in trade. It was a familiar commercial number and could be divided in several useful ways.
12 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, and 6, which is extremely convenient when goods need to be divided among buyers and merchants. It also fit comfortably into the old pre 1970 English monetary system where 12 pennies made a shilling. Those practical advantages help make dozens a more familiar unit in commerce.
Dozens, huh? No pun intended, right, Dr. Dineen? Huh.
Right. Once 12 became the normal quantity, adding one more created an obvious, welcome, and easily understood bonus.
That's right, and we still see the survival of that system. Every time somebody buys a dozen eggs, 12 eggs, almost nobody buying those eggs is thinking about medieval English currency or the mathematical convenience of 12. But the old counting system still remains. And that's also what makes the expression baker's dozen work so well. Everybody knows that 12 is the normal unit, so 13 immediately communicates the idea of the normal amount plus something extra.
And this is where we have to separate the medieval practice from the expression itself. The bread regulations are medieval, but the phrase baker's dozen appears much later in surviving written English. One known example occurs in a work by Thomas Nasty published in 1596, and the expression appears again in the early 17th century, suggesting that readers already understood what it meant.
That's right, Dr. Dineen. And that right there, that creates a gap of several centuries between the medieval bread regulations and the written evidence for the phrase. And a gap that large is exactly why historians like you, Dr. Dineen, have to be cautious about saying that one directly calls the other. We can see that the two ideas fit together very well, but we cannot produce a document from the 13th century announcing that bakers had just invented the baker's dozen.
Chandler, you're exactly right. We should not say, we know that a particular medieval law created the baker's dozen, because we do not know that. What we can say is that medieval England definitely regulated bread weight, definitely severely punished bakers who violated those standards, and later had a well established custom in which a baker's dozen meant 13. Connecting those developments is reasonable, but the surviving evidence does not reveal the exact moment when the practice began.
Yeah, that distinction is important because history often works this way. We can reconstruct a very strong explanation from laws, economic practices, language, and later customs, even when nobody left us a document explaining exactly how the tradition started. So, the medieval bread law explanation remains persuasive without pretending that the historical record is more complete than it really is.
Now, what I find especially interesting is the meaning and how it has really changed. The meaning of the extra loaf of bread, it appears to have changed over time. It's quite interesting to me. If the medieval explanation is correct, then the additional bread began primarily as protection for the baker rather than as a gift to the customer. But today we interpret the same behavior completely differently. Like if we were going into a donut shop and they give us 13 when we buy 12, then we automatically assume that the business is rewarding us with a bonus.
The action survives even though the reason behind it has changed. The medieval baker may effectively have been saying, I am making absolutely certain that nobody can accuse me of giving you too little. The modern baker is communicating something closer to, hey, thanks for buying in dozens. So here is one more. What begins as caution eventually becomes a symbol of generosity.
Meanwhile, the legal system that may have encouraged the practice gradually disappeared. The medieval size of bread was replaced by later legislation, and the old statutory system governing bread and bread prices eventually vanished during the 19th century. The remarkable part is the law disappeared while the number 13 survived. People forgot most of the regulations, but they happily remembered the baker's dozen.
Yeah, there is actually a larger principle hiding behind the baker's dozen. Whenever exact measurement is difficult, but falling below the required amount carries a penalty, people tend to build in a margin of safety. Engineers do it, manufacturers do it, and businesses still do it. Medieval bakers may have been applying essentially the same principle centuries ago, just with loaves of bread instead of modern engineering tolerances.
And the difference is that their safety margin happened to be edible. And when the extra amount goes to the customer, then there's very little reason for the customer to complain about the system. And that may also help explain why the custom became memorable. People usually object when an error costs them something, but they tend to remember an error rather fondly when it works in their favor.
And that is one reason the baker's dozen has survived long after the regulatory system that may have encouraged it. The expression describes something immediately understandable, a standard quantity with a little extra built in. What began as a practical response to economic regulation eventually became part of everyday language. Few people using the phrase today realize how much medieval law and medieval commerce may be hiding behind it.
So the next time someone hands you 13 donuts and calls it a baker's dozen, don't imagine or assume the baker simply just forgot how to count. The tradition may exist precisely because bakers understood counting and they understood measurement and the consequences of coming up short extremely well. What looks today like a friendly bonus may therefore preserve the memory of a much tougher commercial world. And in that world, adding something extra could protect both your reputation and your livelihood.
We should also finish with the historical caution we began with, friends. The assizes of bread and ale are real, the regulations concerning bread weight are real, and punishments for violations are documented. The custom of providing extra bread is also well established. but the exact chain connecting those medieval regulations to the later phrase baker's dozen cannot be proven from surviving records. It remains a very plausible explanation rather than a documented moment of invention.
Leaves us with a remarkably durable piece of economic history. 12 is a dozen, while 13 is a baker's dozen. And that extra loaf may have begun not as a gift, but as one of the oldest forms of business insurance you could eat. So, for things you don't know, I'm wishing you all to come back and join us for another episode of Quick and Quirky.